Welcome to the Stormsurf Video Surf Forecast for Tuesday, February 4th. Looking at the significant wave height charts for the North Pacific for today, we see a little area of what appears to be low pressure, small area fetch, generating 22-foot seas, aimed actually even west of Hawaii, basically nothing off the U.S. west coast, little something trying to go on off the Kuril Islands, Japan, but in general, a very calm pattern. First, let's examine the jet stream. The jet stream winds and height about 30,000 feet in the air determine the storm track and provide energy for developing storms down at the ocean surface. What we see as of today is weak wind pattern coming off Japan, instantly splitting with the northern branch of the jet heading up into the Bering Sea. It then dips south, forms a bit of a trough just east of the date line. Little bit of pocket of winds here, 140 knots, feeding that trough, providing some decent support for low pressure development, but nothing exceptional. And actually, this flow here rejoins the main path, so you get a little boost in the wind speeds here. But then the whole mess pretty much slides up, and pushes inland over north central California. The issue here is the split jet, of course. It steals wind energy from the main flow of the jet. Winds are generally light the whole way across here. I mean, you'd want to see it a lot in the 150, 160 knot range, and a lot broader and over a larger area. So basically a pretty light pattern here. We'll put this into motion, see how it plays out for the next couple of days. This trough hangs on into Wednesday, but it's already fading by then and basically is gone by Thursday morning. The split is still continuing. In fact, there's some large circulation up here, even north of the Bering Sea, just stealing piles of energy from the jet. This continues on into Friday and the weekend, and then here you go back into the fully split pattern with a return flow coming into the Gulf of Alaska. We'll go back a day. There you go. So you see actually a little bit of a upper circulation starting to develop here. That'll provide some support for low pressure development. But down in here, it's basically a mess. There's no coherent stream of energy, no troughs, nothing to support low pressure development or much less gale development. So pretty much that's it on Sunday there in the Gulf. And even that peters out by into Monday morning. Still a little bit of support, but just rather weak. Continues on. Here's the split again, the return flow. Interesting part about this is, though, relative to the drought in California, what used to be occurring was a big split off here off Hawaii with the northern branch going up into Canada, southern branch heading down towards the equator. Now we have a semi-coherent flow moving into the U.S. west coast. And actually, if we put this into motion, even as early as Wednesday, that sets up, and you got this steady flow, almost a trough over the U.S. west coast into Thursday. Sort of lifts a little bit north of California by the weekend, but not completely out. And then the jet is really almost on just south of the border in northern California. So that looks like it's going to provide some relief for the U.S. west coast with potential for precipitation. And that pretty much goes, it lifts further north, so the focus will be on the Pacific Northwest into Wednesday of next week. But that's the good news in this. There's not a whole lot in terms of support for swell-producing storms or gales, but there is some hope for moisture for the U.S. west coast. Next, let's go down to the surface, examine surface level wind speeds, directions, and pressure. As was hinted on the wave height chart, there is low pressure in the western Gulf of Alaska, fetch of, 35 knot winds, but it's pushing pretty well east or west of the Great Circle tracks into Hawaii. A little bit of sideband fetch here, but not a whole lot. This is actually remnants of a previous low that has produced swell that it should be arriving in Hawaii tonight into Wednesday morning. A little bit of a low pressure here off Japan, not organized. Most of the fetch is pushing north up into the off of Kamchatka and of no real interest. And then weak high pressure off the U.S. west coast. Let's put this into motion and see how things play out. The low here by into Wednesday, it's all but gone. It's actually retrograding so that doesn't do anything for Hawaii, the U.S. West Coast. And the low that formed off Japan is already landlocked behind the Kuril Islands and of no interest. High pressure sort of holding off the U.S. West Coast. But then we're into Thursday. There's actually a little low here, and I'll pull that back. It just starts forming like Wednesday night into Thursday, and then eases its way into the U.S. West Coast. No storm production, no swell production here, but it's good for maybe some moisture, and that's worthy of note. Out in the greater Pacific, virtually nothing of interest going on. Then we get into about Saturday, and you notice a low pressure system starting to develop, rather broad, but somewhat diffuse too. This is supported by that upper low we saw that was actually formed almost a closed circulation here in the Gulf. Regardless, it developed some fetch by Saturday night, a little pocket of 45 knot winds. This initially is aimed at Hawaii, that fetch, not so much at the U.S. West Coast. But then you get into Sunday night, and now you have fetch blowing into towards northern California, 45 knot fetch. It doesn't last particularly long, good for a little bit, but by Monday night it's all but gone, and that's kind of the end of it. This is now we're into 25 knot winds, and that's wind swell only. Won't even survive much moving into California. Yeah, good for maybe some 10-second period wind swell, but not a whole lot beyond that. And then it's over. So the pattern is definitely very quiet. So finally, let's examine the effects of those winds on the ocean surface in terms of sea height production and therefore swell. As mentioned, 22-foot seas, western Gulf, and they are aimed a bit at Hawaii, but this is really the tail end of a previous system and does not do a whole lot. We'll take the Hawaii Great Circle Pass off there, and you sort of see we just roll this out and not a whole lot is going on. You saw that little bit of fetch here starting to develop relative to Hawaii, but we're talking 18-foot seas or less. That's basically wind swell until you get into Sunday. There we go. Now we're into 28-foot seas, aimed reasonably well at Hawaii, a bit far away, but not too bad. And real north angle here, we're talking in the 345 degree range initially for a short blast, and then it just as quickly disappears and takes focus on California. We're in the 294 degree path range there, and then it does get up to 30-foot seas, but the energy now is starting to push up this way, probably more for the Pacific Northwest than California even. And by Monday, it's pretty much over, and that's where it leaves us, and things really settle down. So clearly a slack pattern compared to what we had 2 weeks ago or so when the whole North Pacific lit up. Not unexpected, really. You get these pulses. One would like to say it was related to the active phase of the MJO, but it wasn't so much this time. Not directly, but we'll examine that next. So we'll start our tour of the long-term forecast. First off, Southern Oscillation Index. Difference in pressure between Darwin, Australia, and Tahiti. Negative numbers indicate the active phase of the MJO, that is more low pressure in Tahiti, higher pressure in Darwin, and positive numbers represent the inactive phase, and that tends to suppress storm development in the Pacific, where the active phase enhances storm development in the North Pacific in the winter. Right now, daily SOI number 8.21, reasonably high. The 30-day average 13.99, relatively high again, and the 90-day running average 7.35. You look here, we started somewhere in early January with this big spike of high positive numbers, and it really just hasn't given up any ground at all the entire month. We're into February. It all looks like the inactive phase of the MJO. If you go by purely the SOI numbers, we'll see otherwise. And clearly, the 30-day trend has been on the upswing, as has been the 90-day trend. That same pattern can be seen here with the massive upward spike in the SOI index. This is the 30-day average graphed out. So we went from sort of hovering around neutral in the fall to just going back up to as high as we've been in almost 2 years, and that's being reflected at the surface. This is not good. We really want to see this moving into the negative territory if we were going to get any support for storm development. Let's take a look at surface level wind anomalies. That is variation from normal for this time of year. We're in the West Pacific here, this chart. Pretty much neutral anomalies, a little bit hint of westerly anomalies. Westerly anomalies are suggestive of the active phase of the MJO. Easterly anomalies or enhanced trades are suggestive of the inactive phase of the MJO. So we have pretty much nothing going on, neutral in the West Pacific till we get to the date line, some westerly anomalies. Those westerly anomalies continue south of Hawaii and then fade out as we move in towards Central America. This is actually the remnants of what has been a incredibly strong, well, not incredibly, but very solid run of westerly winds that have been occurring in the West Pacific virtually the entire month of January, and we'll get into that more in just a minute. Now looking a week out, same location, West Pacific, we see easterly anomalies starting to build, or at least forecast to build in the maritime continent almost to the date line. This is suggestive of the inactive phase of the MJO. And as we move along the equator over to the under Hawaii, weak easterly anomalies sort of suggests that an inactive phase is trying to take root. Now notice there are different anomalies, or actually enhanced anomalies up here at 20 north, but really the focus is about 5 degrees either side of the equator and nothing more. Now let's look at another version of that same chart. Think of it this way. This side of the chart is the West Pacific. This is the East Pacific, but we have time here. Red is westerly anomalies, blue or easterly anomalies. Red is the active phase of the MJO, and as you can see, almost as soon as we got into January, by the 7th, we started picking up westerly anomalies, and this is, we'll slide this up here, 120 east, 180, about 140, so the very far West Pacific. This is important, and we'll see why in a minute. Westerly anomalies built, and we had a peak in around between the 25th and the 29th of January. These are strong anomalies too. It goes right to the top of the chart. It's 12 meters per second, different from the norm. This is what is classically called a westerly wind burst, and westerly wind bursts associated with the active phase of the MJO help push warm subsurface water towards the East Pacific, and we'll get more into that. Next, let's look at outgoing long wave radiation forecasts. This is the blue indicates heavier than normal cloud cover. The red and the orange less than normal cloud cover. The blue is the active phase of the MJO. The red the inactive phase. Currently, we are seeing the active phase of the MJO over the date line, but weakening and fading to almost nothing 15 days out. This is per the statistical model. Per the dynamic model, we have a little bit different picture. Again, the active phase is present over the date line. It's supposed to fade 5 days out, but then about 8 days into 15 days out, it supposedly regenerates. Big difference between the two models, where one is showing the inactive phase taking over, the other showing the active phase coming back. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I would suspect that the statistic model is probably closer than the dynamic model to reality. And then we look at the ultra long range forecast. This is a 40-day upper level jet stream level model, but still the same sort of pattern. The greens are the active phase, the orange are the inactive phase. What this suggests is that the active phase is in the West Pacific, and it's going to slowly ease its way into South America, Central America, but not until middle of March. So this is a rather long phase here, and then behind it the inactive phase tries to build, but is not very coherent at all, and pretty much just dissipates by March. So not a real strong pattern one way or the other suggested. And finally, this is a different chart than we've used before, but again, this is another version of surface level wind anomalies. This is like the past 4 days or so, 5 days. The oranges and the reds represent the westerly anomalies, and you can see that westerly wind burst that we talked about a little bit earlier. This is on the 28th of January, again in the far west Pacific, and slowly starting to fade into the 1st of February. So just a different version of what we already saw. Next, let's look at surface level water temperature anomalies. And cooler waters in this region suggests the inactive phase of the MJO, if not outright La Nina. Warmer waters in this region represent the active phase of the MJO and potentially El Nino. At this point in time, and this is kind of a shocker, there's been suggestions of weak cool water here, but it really has jumped out as of the most recent update on February 3rd. Basically a full-on cool pool starting to develop between the Galapagos Islands and the dateline. This is not good news. This is suggestive of the inactive phase of the MJO at a minimum, and is also symptomatic of those rising SOI numbers that we looked at earlier. So this is not good news. What's also, and it's interesting because previously there had been a cool pool that developed here off Africa, and sometimes when that shows up, it also is a reflection of what's going on in the Pacific, or it can actually predate itself over here and then show up over in the Pacific. Kind of not sure whether there really is a teleconnection between that previous cool pool that was off Africa and this one, but it's something of note. The other thing of note here, though, is that there's lots of warm water piled up off of Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and this is a result of a Kelvin wave that was generated earlier that's been impacting this area now for about a month. We'll get into that a little bit more, but the thought is that this warm water at some point is going to start getting picked up by the trades, blowing to the west and fill in some of these gaps, but that's not guaranteed either, so it's more idle speculation at this point in time. Also of note, warm water between Japan, U.S. West Coast. We've been watching this for a couple of months now. It's actually made more inroads to California, and there was actually a little cool pool that had developed here from high pressure that had been just so dominant for basically years. Had carved out a cool pool coming off of California to south of Hawaii. That's all but gone now, filled in. So there's warm water here, that's good. There's warm water here, that's good. There's warm water here, that's good. But all of a sudden this cool pool is developed, and it's a head scratcher at a minimum, but that's the way these things go sometimes. It's not always linear, and it kind of goes in fits and starts. Now here's another view of that same situation. This is absolute water temperatures along the equator in the Pacific. This is temperatures relative to normal. Here's the cool pool between about 140 and almost the date line. And you can actually see the wind arrows here, wind anomalies, pretty much a slack pattern across the Pacific. This is the far more interesting chart. Assume this to be the West Pacific here. This is the East Pacific. These are absolute temperatures along the equator, 2 degrees south and 2 degrees north of the equator. It's not so much the absolute temperatures that we're interested in, it's the variations from normal. And what we see here is a large pool of warmer than normal water, now 4 degrees above normal, and this is under the date line. This, we suspect, is another Kelvin wave, and a much stronger one than the one we saw that started a couple of months ago that we've been monitoring. This we believe to be the result of that strong westerly wind burst that occurred in January. So there's two things actually in play here. There's the warm pool here, but there's also a cool pool off of Ecuador down at about 75 meters or so. This was actually much stronger even a week ago. It was almost 2 degrees below normal. It seems to be moderating, and what the hope is that this cool pool, which is also actually manifesting itself at the surface a little bit right here, is actually going to blow out of here as the Kelvin wave starts progressing eastward. So the typical path is westerly wind burst, winds blowing from west to east, pushes warm water down, and then that pool migrates the whole way across the Pacific into the East Pacific, impacts South America and then erupts on the surface and then travels back along the surface and provides a El Nino-like warm tongue or a finger extending off of Central America. Right now we don't see any of that. We know there's warm water off of Central America. We see another charge of it building up here, but it's not guaranteed that this is going to be able to penetrate the cool pool that's off of Central America at the moment. The hope is that it will, though. And finally, the Nino 3.4 sea surface temperature anomaly forecast. This is in the, we'll call it the El Nino region, that same patch where the cool water currently is sitting. This is a projection from one model, NOAA's, the National Weather Service's model, which has consistently been suggesting some sort of warming developing in that region as of February, building through April into July, and then up to about 1.2, 1.1.5 degrees in October. Long ways out, but that is suggestive of El Nino developing for this coming fall, but that's better part of 9 to 10 months away. Something to watch. This is not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination, but the presence of what's been 2 westerly wind bursts, we believe a second Kelvin wave developing, are all good signs. Clearly we're moving away from La Nina, which we had been in for a couple of years after the 2009-2010 El Nino. We thought we were moving into a pure neutral pattern, if not going warm. The little bit of the cool pool that's recently developed on the equator is a bit of a head scratcher, especially seeing how we've got the active phase of the MJO, westerly wind bursts, and all sorts of other things that are suggestive that we're moving into a warmer pattern. So there's still kind of a mixed message being given by the ocean, but something to consider. So that wraps up our forecast for this week. Surf-wise, the pattern is slack, not a whole lot going on. Long-term wise, there's potential westerly wind bursts, Kelvin wave. For the most part, the signals are looking positive. The cold water on the equator that's recently developed is not quite making sense, but the suspicion is this will all sort itself out in the next week or so. So we'll keep watching and we'll provide information as it becomes available. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed our forecast.